This is a follow-up to our online talk on human rights due diligence in public procurement, which we had last month in December 2021. And it's a talk that generated a lot of interest and questions. So we decided to ask Christine and Pauline whether we could take a bit more of their time to explore a few more details together. So as I was saying, I'm here again with Pauline Gottberg. She is the National Coordinator on Sustainable Procurement for the Swedish Region's Secretariat, and also with Christine Talbo, who is the Sustainability Strategist at the Swedish Central Purchasing Body, ADA. So thank you so much, Pauline and Christine, for being our guests again. And let's dive into some questions straight on. So something that we did not have the chance to discuss during the online talk is the types of human rights violations that you are tackling in your work. So can you give us some examples, and maybe also it would be useful to tell us which countries or which geographical regions you are paying attention to, and if you cover production processes which are also likely to happen maybe in Europe and not necessarily also in third countries.
Thank you, Anna. I can start. So the way we are working is that we're basing our work on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which means that when we do our own risk analysis and our risk assessments, we start at a higher level. We look at the rights in the International Bill of Human Rights, which, for those of you who don't know, is the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and the two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, that are codifying the declaration. So we are looking at all the rights, but when we do this, we follow the UN Guiding Principles, which means that we're looking at, and also the OECD due diligence guidance, actually. So we're looking at likelihood and severity, which means obviously that there are certain human rights that are regarded as more severe, such as forced labor, but we don't jump straight into forced labor issues. We look at the broader scope and then we narrow it down. And I also wanted to mention that, so how you do this, because for many people, maybe likelihood is something that you've heard of, but when you look at human rights risks, it's really important to focus on severity. And what is severity? So severity is explained in detail in both the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD due diligence guidance. We don't have time to go into detail here, but it has to do with what they call scale, scope, and irremediability. And there are rules or principles for how you do this. So if anyone is interested, I suggest that you go into those documents and go from there.
Maybe I can add something. I think the question is very, very relevant. I mean, this is a question we often get. Isn't it very difficult for procurement officers or suppliers to identify all human rights risk that is included in the Bill of Human Rights? But as Christine said, it is the risk analysis that will guide what human rights risk will be in focus. And also as a first step, I think in any risk analysis, knowing your supply chains, where are the products being manufactured, to have visibility over your supply chains. I mean, obviously that is not important just for detecting human rights risk, but also fundamental for building, robust and resilient supply chains, which has proven, I think, even more important now during the COVID crisis. But I think also, it might not be as difficult, maybe, I don't know, as it sounds. But let me give it just like two examples on how to know which rights to tackle. I represent the healthcare sector in Sweden, so we procure large amounts of medical gloves. And I think approximately like 75 or 80% of those gloves are being manufactured in Malaysia. And Malaysia is a country which is highly dependent on migrant workers from Bangladesh, from Nepal, Burma, you know. And those migrant workers are often, you know, their rights are often being violated, like recruitment practices that sometimes lead to debt bondage, you know, slave labor. So in this particular industry, you know, forced labor, slave labor, and human trafficking should be prioritized. And if you go to the main geographical region, I think here, look, Malaysia is probably, you know, the geographical location you should look at, even though we know that many medical gloves are being manufactured in Thailand, etc. So maybe that's like one concrete example. And you said, you know, we are not only focusing on Asia. I mean, here, let's say food, for example. I mean, I think we serve like 77,000 portions of food every day to patients in hospitals. And a lot of the fruits and vegetables, you know, are being produced in Europe, such as Spain, Italy. And I think the working conditions that the agricultural workers face in, for example, Spanish farms have been reported by different actors, including the European Union. And agriculture is, of course, like a very labor-intensive sector that highly relies on migrant workers. And southern Spain is also mentioned as a key gateway to Europe for many African migrants. So some farmers or companies that take advantage of the vulnerability of these people. So here we have seen examples like from less severe exploitation, such as severe overtime, contracts, etc., to more forced labor and trafficking. So I visited some farms like a few years ago in Spain, and here, you know, the auditor was actually threatened, and the workers were not allowed to speak to the auditor, etc. So in that way, if you have the risk analysis, that will guide you to what type of human rights risk to address, and also what kind of geographical area to focus on.
Yeah, what you're mentioning just now, Pauline, I think is very interesting, because we hear a lot about violation of human rights in supply chains, which sometimes are far removed geographically from where we live, but there are cases indeed, and it's sometimes they're all over the press, so it's very difficult to ignore those. I mean, it's much easier to ignore something that is happening in Asia, but when it's happening in Europe, it's probably something that we have some kind of also basic knowledge of. So it's not surprising to me that you mentioned this, but it's also something that I don't necessarily hear that much when we discuss public procurement supply chains, and especially in the field of food. Mm. And I just wanted to briefly mention also that some of the documents that Christine mentioned, we will link them in the description to this video, so they are easily accessible for everyone.
Yes. And I can just mention, I mean, Sweden is not free from these kind of problems either. I mean, we have people coming from far around the world picking berries in Swedish forests, and their labor rights are severely violated. And so I think we can find this in many countries, including our own.
Yes. Yeah. Let me move also to another follow-up question that I wanted to ask you, which is maybe a little bit more technical, but during the webinar, we also discussed a bit how you use contract clauses, and how these contract clauses include also supplier commitments, and how to fulfill these supplier commitments. So can you maybe give us some concrete example of these supplier commitments?
I will try to do that, and I'm sharing my screen. You can see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the website of the Upphandlingsmyndigheten, which is the Swedish National Public Procurement Agency. And also this link will be distributed by Anna, shared by Anna. So the Swedish Public Procurement Agency, they have a criteria database where you can find lots of different award criteria for public procurement. And one is sustainable supply chains. And I just want to say from the start that we are updating these criteria right now, sustainable supply chains, and hopefully in May there will be new out. But obviously these are publicly available for everyone within Europe or the EU. So I just want to, they're divided into 4 different bullets, basically. The first one is the supplier obligation or supply commitment. And these bullets here basically cover the UN Global Compact. So they cover human rights. They cover, here you have child labor in Article 32 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Here you have the ILO core conventions, which obviously it's forced labor, child labor, discrimination in the workplace, and freedom of association, other types of union rights. We have labor law enforced in the country where the work is performed, and then the environmental law enforced in the work in the country where the work is performed, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. So these are the commitments as they look right now. We are developing this. I think we will talk a bit more about that a little bit later. But so this is the obligations or commitments as such. But then we have bullet 2 here, policies and routines, and this is based on the UN guiding principles, and basically this is the due diligence process. So we require them to have a due diligence process in place. We're not using the term due diligence here, I think partly because that term was not as used when by Swedish companies in terms of human rights due diligence when these commitments were developed a few years ago. But in the new version, we are using the terms that are used in the UN guiding principles and the OECD due diligence guidance. But again, so this is, they should have a policy in place. They should have a division of responsibility. It's important to do, like the main thing here is the risk analysis, which is also where most, where we see most deviations from the contract terms. And in these contract clauses, we also have, our methods for follow-up. So self-assessment questionnaires and audits, and how we manage any deviations or breaches of the contract. So they're quite long, and they will be even longer in the newer version. But they're here and they're available for everyone to use.
Thank you very much. I see that you mentioned also audits, which are part of the contract clauses. And one of the questions that we always get and which we wondered about ourselves is who pays for office audits and factory audits, but also how you organize them, and clearly these are specifically foreseen in the procurement contract. So I'm wondering also to what level of detail you include them in the contract.
Well, I can start there. So first of all, at the moment, the public authorities pay for them, so we pay for them. There are some discussions that maybe we should at least require the suppliers to pay for re-audits, because we don't usually, we don't just do one audit, but we have a re-audit to try to manage the deviations. And sometimes there can be 3 re-audits, and maybe that type of cost, if the supplier doesn't do what they are supposed to do, maybe that type of cost should be put on the supplier. But this is just discussions and different ideas at different from different players or actors. At the moment, we're paying for them, so the contracting authorities are paying for them. how we do it more specifically, well, they start with a self-assessment questionnaire, and then we usually go to office audits. So we make a distinction between office audits and factory audits. And I will let Pauline talk about the factory audits, and I will give you a bit of information about the office audits. So the office audits, then we use consultants as auditors, and they visit the office of the supplier. I mean, many of our suppliers are wholesalers and they don't have any type of production themselves. They might have a warehouse, but no production. So at the first stage, there's an office audit where the consultant or the auditor interviews relevant staff, management staff, and reviews documents to see if the answers provided in the self-assessment questionnaire are correct, and also what they are not, or if they are fulfilling the contract terms or not, basically. The routine requirements or the due diligence requirements. Are they doing risk analysis? Is their policy covering all the issues in the obligation or the commitment? So yes, that's the office audit, and usually so then the auditor writes an audit report, and then usually we go back if there's an action plan, a corrective action plan set up. We go back around 6 months later, and we do a re-audit, and sometimes we do a second and a third re-audit. And in terms of cost, I just wanted to mention this because yes, we do pay for them. It's hard to estimate exactly how much these cost, but we estimate that between in euros 1,700 or 2,400 euros per audit. And then imagine if you do 3 re-audits for the same supplier. But that's the cost, and then obviously we also have a cost for the work that we do to coordinate and manage and the audit as such and the audit results. And we estimate that cost, it's a 40-hour per audit, so that is also a cost for the contracting authority.
Okay, should I add the factory audits that we sometimes, I mean, on occasions we also do like the spot checks in factories, and we don't do as many as the office audits, obviously, because they are more costly and they're more time consuming as well. But as Christine was saying, you know, according to the contract, we have the right to do follow-ups, both office audits, but also factory audits, and these audits, I mean, we use third-party auditors. We don't do them ourselves because we're not auditors and we don't speak the language or know the local legislation, etc. So they will also visit the production facility, and here it's basically the same setup. You know, there will be interviews with management, with staff. We will look at documents like pay slips or timesheets, contracts, etc. There will be like a factory tour looking at health and safety issues, but there will also be visiting like dormitories to make sure that workers have you know, sufficient space, that they have like lockers. Sometimes, you know, you need your own locker to put your passport, because this is a problem in many countries where maybe the employer will take care of the passport. So this is what we can do. And also, I mean, we can do them at our suppliers' own production sites or at sub-suppliers' production sites. I would just like to say that, you know, I think here it's very, very important that the auditor's competence and methodology it has to be adapted to this to the industry or the specific risk that you want to address, because these general audit schemes sometimes do not detect the specific risks, like, for example, forced labor. So different risks require different measures and competences. And it's the same with the factory audits. It's the contracting authority that finance them or pay for them. And I think the cost is around approximately like 100,000 Swedish kronor. So what's that, like 10,000 euros or something like that, approximately. But here I think it's very time consuming, because sometimes it can be very tricky to find, name and addresses and get the right permissions to actually visit these factories, etc. So yeah, so that's basically.
I can also add that one reason why it's not as time consuming to do the office audits in regards to our own the number of hours we put down is that we have a framework agreement for auditors that we use for the office audits, but we don't use it for the factory audits for the reasons that Pauline is saying, that they need to be more specific, for instance, in terms of language skills. So I think when you did your factory audits in Malaysia, Pauline, you had auditors that spoke 7 languages, I think. Yeah. So the audit team has to be put together in a different way, and so for those audits we do direct audit, direct procurements instead of using the framework agreement.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think it illustrates quite well the fact that this requires quite a bit of planning for the contracting authority, and a bit of an investment. I would say my first impression is that it's more an investment in terms of resources and actually planning than a financial investment, although obviously all of these services have a cost, so that is something you cannot avoid, but the cost doesn't seem exaggerated. It's more really about getting into the mentality and planning these sort of things. Maybe a couple of other questions on the audits which we received is they relate, well, first of all, to the impacts and the conclusions that you've been able to draw from your audits or from your monitoring activity during the execution of the contract. And also you mentioned during the webinar that you share audits among several authorities. So I remember we had a discussion right after the online talk with colleagues. Is this something that where you have to get permission from the contractors in advance, and how also do you cooperate for this?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh,
sorry, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Just in terms of impact, in terms of the office audits, what we see is that we see improved codes of conduct over time. We see clearer divisions of responsibilities, that they actually appoint people that do these type of risk assessments and risk analysis, and also monitor their contracts. And specifically, we do see an improvement in how they do their risk analysis. I want to say that what I often see is that suppliers, they think that a supplier assessment is a risk analysis. So, but there's a difference here. So there's a supplier assessment, because most suppliers, they have some kind of supplier assessment of, for instance, the factory where they're sourcing from. And that might be some kind of checklist or something like that they require their supplier to fill out. But what we're looking for is the risk assessment or risk analysis before that, because they don't even know what questions they need to pose to the supplier in that checklist if they don't do the risk analysis beforehand. And when it comes to that type of risk analysis, you have to look at country risks, but you also have to look at sector risk. You have to look at raw material risk, and you have to look at the whole supply chain, which is also something that we're trying to make our suppliers to grasp. So we see over time, we see sometimes small shifts, but we do see shifts. And we do see, because we do this regardless of, we have all of these type of sectors that are well known in terms of sustainability, in clothes or plastic gloves, but we also do it for coffee machines and road salt and like all of these things that contracting authorities buy. And often we work with small suppliers that are first quite shocked when we reach out and want to do these things. But all of a sudden, they have an epiphany and they decide, okay, we're going to become the best in the business on these issues, which is what happened with one of our coffee machine suppliers a few months ago. So we do see that we have impact. There's small steps, but we have impact, and that's great to see.
Yeah, maybe I can add. I mean, I think this is really relevant because, is public procurement an effective tool to address these kind of challenges that we want to address? I think what we would like to see, and I think everyone thinks of impact as maybe improving working conditions or eradicating slave labor or, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what Christine shows here is that, yes, I will give you some examples of that as well. But in order for that to happen, our direct suppliers needs to have these due diligence processes in place, because nothing will happen unless our direct suppliers start doing their job in the supply chain. Over the years, we've been cooperating with ADA now for many years, and we're doing this for 10 years, and we can see a lot of improvements. We had these issues of child labor making our surgical instruments in Pakistan. At least in the exporting factories now, we see large improvements. When it came to these 3 factories in Malaysia, for example, where we had debt bondage, slave labor, excessive overtime, harassment, everything. All 3 factories have now not only implemented zero cost policies, i.e. no workers should pay to get a job, but also they have repaid recruitment fees to the workers, so they are no longer in debt bondage. And that's major improvements. So yes, I would say that, public procurement can be extremely effective policy tool to address these issues, but it's never enough just to make the requirements, because unless you follow up on those requirements, you will not see any change.
Yeah, that's a very important lesson, I think, across the board. I have the feeling also from what both of you have just told me that this has the potential to go even further than just human rights. It pushes also the main supplier to rethink about its supply chain relations, because in part, these risks, no matter whether they are human rights risks or not purely human rights risks, they also reflect on his capacity to actually deliver the contract. And in the end, this transparency, yes, it implies more work for the main supplier, but it also maybe serves its interests as well.
Pauline, maybe we should I think we forgot to answer the question of the sharing of audit results.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, we did. I think this is really important because even though maybe the regions are large buyers, I think we procure for like 15 billion euros a year. I mean, we're still a very small buyer on the global market, so we need to cooperate. And one of the big benefits here is that, you know, we don't have to audit the same suppliers. We can actually share the results. So Christine doesn't have to go and do audits at the same places that we do. And maybe one challenge is here, how do you do that? Because obviously in Sweden, we have the, I mean, the principle of public access to information, I mean, is a fundamental principle here, and we have this act. However, obviously, we need to exclude company sensitive information in those reports before sharing. But, I mean, company names and all the violations that we do find, those are not company sensitive information, so that will be shared before we you know, and we will share them between ourselves, but also with our Nordic colleagues. So I think here we have a great potential if we can find ways of actually becoming more being able to share information. Maybe this is something for you, Anna, to create like a platform for these kind of sharing, because that would be a one-stop shop to go to look at what have other countries done. Do I need to do another audit, or can I just rely on what's there?
Yeah, that's a very good idea, actually.
We use a stoplight system for parts of our audits that we disclose on our website when you're signed in, and that type of shared platform would be really useful. And right now, I mean, it would be excellent if that would take place at a European level, but we're also thinking now to try to make a special website for Swedish public procurement authorities that would be the regions. It would be ADA. If we could, we would like to include the central government, central purchasing body as well. I work for the municipalities and regions, our central purchasing body. And yeah, but obviously it requires that all the auditors that are doing these kind of monitoring, they use the same method. It requires the same documents. It requires the same assessment manuals and all of these things. So it's not a thing that you can set up just one day from one day to the next. But looking ahead, that would definitely be really, really useful.
So it's not just about creating, let's say, the community to share, but it's also about harmonizing a little bit how you work on the topic and what kind of information you require. Because
yes,
yeah. But it's definitely a good idea to keep in mind for the future. Also because we are planning to work a bit more in terms of sharing our actions with the community, especially of buyers, but not only. So that would in a way fit the way we will try to work in the next few years. I'm coming to my last question, which is about something that Christine mentioned before, in particular the fact that you are working on a new set of contract clauses, so you are revising them. And I was wondering which issues you're trying to address now that were not fully addressed, that are not fully addressed in the current set of clauses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic that Pauline and I are working hard on, together with the National Public Procurement Agency, and also a group of stakeholders. I think we're around 30, right, Pauline? Yeah, something like that. So what we're aiming to do, one idea is to first of all, to develop the actual issue so that we have the definition of forced labor, the definition of decent working hours and so forth in the text, so that people can, so it becomes more of a legal text in that sense. But other things that we're really trying to work on now is so we want to take these clauses and make them even closer, make sure that they are even closer to the wording of the UN guiding principles and the OECD due diligence guidance. So using the right terms, such as due diligence, but also including things that we haven't included so far, and that includes particularly vulnerable groups, that when you make a risk assessment, risk analysis, you have to take into account particularly vulnerable groups, which in the international context is usually specified as women, children, indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, migrant workers, and so forth. We also want to include human rights and environmental rights defenders in that, because we know especially environmental rights defenders are very, very targeted at this point in time. So those are two things. We are aiming to include remedy. So what Pauline was talking about, that the plastic gloves factories in Malaysia, that they're actually repaying these recruitment fees that are part of debt bondage, that is remedy. So that is something that we're also thinking of including, or actually we need to include. That's the next step. It's not just about making sure that these things don't happen in the future. You have to also try to correct the wrong that you've actually done, and that can be done in different ways. So we're not in the text, we're not writing how to conduct remedy, because it depends completely on the issue at hand. And it's also extremely important that in that process you are involving the stakeholders, the victims of the violation, so they have to be part of deciding what remedies actually are or should be. So those are a few things. Traceability, that we don't have traceability as such. We have right now, there's a requirement to map the supply chain. The thing is that no one really takes that seriously, to be honest. If we're lucky, they are mapping the first tier, the factory, the final assembly factory. But we will put tougher requirements in terms of traceability, and that is also related to proposed legislation such as the international international procurement instrument, and also obviously the hopefully upcoming human rights due diligence legislation. So yes, there are several things that we need, that we feel that we need to put into these clauses.
Which is it's interesting to hear about this, and in particular about traceability, because I suppose, I mean, I would assume that for some goods which are resold by a wholesaler or assembled in the first tier, let's say, I suppose that there is some kind of traceability, at least on the quality of the product. So there should be, I mean, even firms should have a way to trace back the different components, at least if the product is assembled. So why not have wider traceability? It's probably, these are probably the elements which allow a company to trace back also more elements of the production process. I don't, it's probably difficult, but I don't think it's something impossible to be required of businesses.
No, and I also want to add that, as you know, Ursula von der Leyen has said that we are looking at some kind of forced labor legislation at the EU level, some kind of import ban in the same sense as that the American withhold release orders that the Customs and Border Protection is administrating. And for that type of tool to be effective, you need traceability. Because and for many goods you need it to the raw material level, because I mean we work with solar panels, and we know that the big issue in terms of forced labor, The big risk is in the raw material, in the polysilicon production in Xinjiang in China. And obviously we know that this type of import ban, forced labor import ban, is meant to be able to handle or manage that type of risk. And then we need traceability.
Absolutely. Thank you very much once again for taking the time to share more insights with us and with our community. I'm really very, very thankful to you both. And to conclude, just a quick reminder that we will have an online talk again on February 24th at 12 p.m. and it will tackle gender equality. And also don't forget to become a member of the LinkedIn groups we set up, Agents of Innovation Procurement and Actors for Social Impact Procurement. And you will find all the registration links along with the links to some other useful documents and instruments in the description below. And see you at the next Social Procurement Online Talk. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.